She wore a raspberry beret, kind you find in a secondhand store. Raspberry beret, I think I love her. Raspberry beret, kind you find in a secondhand store. Raspberry beret. Let's go.
Doobie-doobie-doo. 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 I'm your host, sabrinasalvati. Doobie-doobie-doo. I'm your host, sabrinasalvati. Doobie-doobie-doo. 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 I'm your host, sabrinasalvati.
All right. Welcome. Happy Sunday. I hope your weekend has been going okay. We are actually under a pseudo tornado warning here, so the weather's been a little crazy, but I'm here. So welcome to Sabs podcast. I'm your host, Sabrina Salvati. I can't wait to get into this. We have so many things to discuss. I'm actually going to jump right into the news stories. I usually give shout outs in the chat, but I actually have 5 stories to discuss in a short amount of time. I have a hard stop on Sundays, but if you are new, I want to let you know that Sabs podcast is a part of Revolutionary Blackout Network. You can catch me there on Thursdays and Fridays, and you can catch me here on Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, and Sundays. Shout out to everyone watching on YouTube, Rockfin, Twitter, and Rumble. And let's go ahead and dig right in. First and foremost, I want to give a shout out to everyone who is a Sabby patron. Thank you guys for holding down the fort and doing what you can. If you're interested in being a Sabby patron, I have 5 categories: Ultimate, Sabinators, Sabsters, Sabbies, and of course, members. All of their names are listed here. You can also see their names scrolling across the bottom of the screen there on the ticker. And I want to give a special shout out to new Sabby patrons. Over here, we call them newbies. Let's give it up for FDA324 and Susan Ninmo. Whoop, whoop. Shout out to all of you guys. Thank you so much for your support. Okay, so today we have a number of things to get into. I'm actually going to start off, I think, with a local story. So let's go ahead and share that thumbnail and let's dive right into today's discussion. So tonight we are discussing Tucker Carlson exposes GOP candidates. Yikes. Boy, was this a doozy. So I wish people could have seen this on like Fox News or something, although, you know, they wouldn't let him ask these questions on Fox News, I don't think. But this really needs more eyes and ears. More people need to see how these candidates responded to Tucker Carlson's questions. And I don't think they would let him ask these questions on mainstream media. So we're going to get into that. We're also going to discuss Professor Richard Wolff China alert. We're going to dive into global capitalism. A warning here from Professor Richard Wolff. He's been keeping us in the know and in the loop where we are going as a country economically. We're also going to discuss Mayor Michelle Wu snitches. Oh my God. Even if you don't live in the Boston area, I think you're going to want to hear this story. It could happen to you. It could be your mayor. We're also going to discuss Justice Democrats upset. This is a story that I think may not be receiving as much attention as it should, but people need to understand what's happening with Justice Democrats. And I'm going to tell you why I believe this is happening. And we're also going to discuss South Carolina ballot initiative. So we are now moving on to South Carolina, and we're almost done with the states. I can't believe it. It seems like I just started talking about these ballot measures yesterday, but we are almost done with the states, you guys. So let's get into our first story. I live in the Boston area. I'm very familiar with Mayor Michelle Wu. I've spoken to her in person, particularly about the housing situation here in Boston. She's the typical Democrat politician. When she was running, she said she ran as a progressive. One of her pressing issues was the housing issue, right? So she has participated in some protests in reference to housing. For example, rent control. That was one of the measures that she's been behind and she's been pushing and still pushing. But I also told you that there were many concerns with Michelle Wu and her so-called progressivism. She is still in some way, shape, or form attached to corporate interests, particularly when it comes to the housing issue. But more importantly, her solution for a lot of the issues that we seem to have in Boston is not in line with what I would consider to be progressivism. For example, I don't think it is a good idea to snitch on residents of Boston. And she's done just that. Get this. Boston Mayor Michelle Wu under fire after sending list of critics and protesters to the police. Yes, you heard that right. So here we're going to get into this article. Here we have the mayor of Boston basically being a snitch. Who does this? Apparently, Mayor Wu does this. Let's get into this article. This is such a mess. Boston Mayor Michelle Wu, a Democrat, is facing criticism from Nixonian tactics after her administration admitted to creating a list of her most vocal critics and providing it to local authorities. Now, I'm just going to say this. You know, where I come from, snitching is not a good thing to do. Okay? Like, people will really come after you if you snitch. But Mayor Michelle Wu, she wants to snitch on people, but at the same time, she doesn't want those people to then confront her and ask her why she's doing what she's doing, or to complain about the police coming to their house. Boston, under Michelle Wu's leadership, is turning into like this authoritarian city. We didn't have to deal with this under Mayor Menino. Now, listen, Mayor Menino had some of his own flaws, but even Mayor Menino knew better. Okay. That's why he was mayor for over like 20 years. We didn't really have to deal with this under Marty Walsh, and Marty Walsh was pro-cop because even Marty Walsh knew better. But Mayor Wu is different. She is the PMC Democrat. So she is Harvard educated. She is not the working class candidates that we've had before. So Mayor Marty Walsh grew up in Dorchester, working class family, kind of knew the labor movement very well. So he was very big on like unionizations, still pro-cop, which I didn't like that. But he found ways to try to attract young people, not just to come to Boston, but to stay here and not leave after college. He realized that we need to offer more things for younger people to do in this city. So he understood some things. Okay. Mayor Menino, who was mayor for like over 20 years, was a little bit more, I guess I would say a little bit more conservative. I mean, he was a Democrat, but he was a little bit more conservative in the sense that he actually wanted to close bars earlier. That didn't end up happening because he did not run again for re-election, but he wanted to make it more of a family city. But again, Mayor Menino grew up in Boston, working class, very different. And then you have Mayor Michelle Wu, and she is snitching on her own residents. Let's go on. The list was made in response to a request from the Boston Police Department after the mayor had been harassed and physically intimidated by individuals for several months outside her home at city functions, such as the annual neighborhood park coffee hours, and at other public events. Now, I want to explain because I've been to the neighborhood park coffee hours, and so has my producer Eric. Actually went with me to one of those as well. In fact, I have a video about it on my channel where I actually confronted Mayor Michelle Wu. The reason why some of these protesters are going to her home is because she has been hiding from them. She is not answering their questions. And what are some of the questions that they have? Some of them are very bitter about the mandates. Yes, believe it or not, even though Boston is blue, that doesn't mean that everyone who's blue here is okay with the mandates. There are also Republicans that live in Boston as well, believe it or not. Some of it is about that. Some of the protests have been about the housing issue, about people being kicked out of public housing, about Mayor Michelle Wu allowing privatization of these housing units, about her allowing other companies and developers to come in and buy these buildings and kick these residents out of their homes and their neighborhoods and their communities that they have known for so long. We've been talking about this for quite a while. In fact, I've interviewed residents in Boston that have been dealing with this. So there are many criticisms of Mayor Wu. And when she is confronted about these questions, it has gotten to the point where she just runs away or she hides in her office and prevents the residents from actually asking her tough questions. If you go out into the neighborhood and you're going to talk with the people, you need to be prepared and ready to answer the questions that they have, whether they're questions you want to hear or not. But you're kicking people out of their homes and then you expect them to be nice and not question you about it. The PMC liberal, professional managerial class, they talk a good game when they are running. They're all progressive. They all agree with these progressive issues when they're running for office. But the moment they're in, they end up being just another corporate Democrat shill. And Mayor Wu is no different. No different. Now, she'll tell you that she grew up in Boston. She'll tell you she's from the streets here. Yeah, but she grew up here, but you went to Harvard and you moved on. You are not of the same class as the people that you once grew up with anymore. And she forgot that very quickly. Very quickly. Let's go on. The acknowledgement by the administration that had compiled the document came after the list was uncovered in an email obtained through a public records request by Wu's opponents, the outlet noted. So they found it. Let's go on. Oh, that's her, by the way. For those of you who don't live here and not familiar, that's her. Oh, and guess what they ran on when she was running? They said we could have a woman of color finally become mayor of Boston. And this is why I told you before. Yes, representation is important, but who is the representation and what exactly are they doing? If they're going to be just like all the other establishment politicians we had before, they're better off staying at home. Now, it goes on to say the tactics used by the administration raise concern over whether Wu and her administration are attempting to silence or to intimidate her critics, many of whom have protested outside her home. The request came after many of the individuals on the list repeatedly impeded the Dorchester Day parade to harass Mayor Wu and her family and staff, yelling through megaphones at her and her children for nearly 90 minutes as they marched in the parade, despite being asked by parade organizers to leave the parade route. So this is a public event. They have every right to be there. Every right to be there. They have every right to confront her about their concerns, especially since she's hiding from them. When people show up to her office to have these conversations with her, she runs and hides. And it's not just the mandates and it's not just the housing issue. There was also the issue with the restaurants in the North End, where Mayor Michelle Wu decided to make them pay, I think it was like $7,000 cleaning fee, street cleaning fee, so that they can allow their customers to eat outside. So you have to remember this was towards the height of the pandemic. And the only way these restaurants could operate and stay in business was to have the customers eat outside. Well, if you've been to Boston and you've been to the neighborhood, the North End, You know that it's very dense. There isn't a lot of sidewalk space. So obviously that would hurt those restaurants in the North End. So that's like where a lot of the Italian restaurants are, right? So she only opposed the fine on them, though, no other neighborhood. So they showed up at her office. She didn't want to talk to them. They showed up at the committee meetings. She didn't want to talk to them then. And they made a big scene. And so she took it back. They went to the news. They went to the media. And then she said, okay, I'm going to take it back. That's what you have to do, because otherwise they just continue to treat you as such. Following the Dorchester Day parade, on June 5th, 2022, Boston police met with city staff on June 10th to make a safety plan for the upcoming Bunker Hill Day parade on June 12th. And the then captain of the district overseeing Charlestown asked for a list of individuals who had been involved in public disruption and harassment of the mayor at the Dorchester Day parade and outside her house. The email was sent as a follow-up immediately after that meeting. So now we have a police state. Now we have police officers in Boston asking for a list of names. This is not okay. Period. Now, what should Mayor Wu have done? Her response should have been, you have to protect those residents' privacy. No, I'm not giving you a list of names of people. They have every right to protest, especially in a public space. But no. She cowered and gave them names. So here we have someone who was supposedly progressive being a friend of the police state. Let's continue. The Herald reported that Wu's actions drew comparisons from some critics to the late President Richard Nixon, who was famous for compiling lists of political opponents. Let's go on. Sent via email from Wu's former director of constituent services, Dave Vittorini, to Boston Police Captain Robert Cecilio. The list, as reported by the Herald, contains the names of Wu's most vocal opponents, such as Boston City Council at-large candidate Catherine Vitale, several anti-jab activists who have been protesting at Wu's house, and the North End restaurant owners who have opposed Wu's policy. So you see what they're doing? They're going after the small businessmen. All those restaurants in North End, those are small businesses. They're going after the small businesses for complaining that she was expecting them to pay $7,000 a month. This is ridiculous. This is ridiculous. And of course, those who were against the mandates. And by the way, you got to remember, my state was locked down. Let's go on. The list included no reason as to why the names were given, and also listed the Mendoza brothers from the North End and a woman with the last name of Thoy, who was arrested before. Wu aides Tiffany Chu and Brianna Miller, who were also CC'd on the email, which was sent after loud protests at the mayor's home in the Roslindale neighborhood of Boston last year. An ordinance was passed in the city prohibiting protests outside of Wu's home during certain hours. Wu, the first woman and first Asian American to hold top political office in Boston history, was sworn into office on November 2021. Now, I want to just show you an example, because here's a protest, actually more so a confrontation, where they went to her office, not her home, went to her office. These parents had their names put on a list. These are parents, had their names put on a list. They went to confront her, and she's hiding and being protected by staff and police. Listen to this.
Games with us, sir. We didn't come here. We are people who have families. We're being targeted on a list, and you giving fuck about a door being knocked on like this? A knock, knock, knock. I want the person who put my...
Eric, we'll need to use volume booster for this one, and I'll start it from the beginning. So it says Boston is under tyrannical rule. And this is true. People need to pay attention to what's happening here.
You're wasting our time. You're playing games with us, sir.
Thank you. Uh-oh, what happened to the, let me refresh it.
People who have families, we're being targeted on a list, and you giving fuck about a door being knocked on like this? I'm knock. I want the person who put my fucking name on a list to target my family to come up here. They're gonna sit here and tell me that I can't knock on a goddamn door that my tax-paying dollars pay for? You got to be kidding me. Bring these people up right now. We didn't come here.
Okay, let's go back because I want you. Oh no, Eric accidentally hit something. Can you bring it back up? Thanks.
With us, sir. We didn't come here. We are people who have families. We're being targeted on a list, and you giving fuck about a door being knocked on like this? I'm knock. I want the person who put my fucking name on a list to target my family to come up here. They're gonna sit here.
You hear this? So this is a parent who said, I want the person who put my name on this list to target my family. They weren't just targeting the parents, but her family members have been targeted. And she's talking about Mayor Wu, who was again hiding in her office. So I wanted to show you guys this because when people say, well, they shouldn't be outside of her house, when they go to her office, she hides too. Let's go on because there's more parents. It's not just this one.
Here and tell me that I can't knock on a goddamn door that my tax-paying dollars pay for? You got to be kidding me. Bring these people up right now. We didn't come here to spend the day with you, no offense.
No babysitting. We're old enough. Okay, we don't need babysitters.
We have children. When you target us, you target my son. When you target me, you target my son.
These are Boston girls.
We are mothers.
Terrible.
We are mothers. When you target our families, you target little children. This is not a game.
No.
Terrible.
Do any of you have children? This is not a game. Targeting me, targeting my son.
That's right. FBI, Department of Homeland Security. Let's talk about where this list went to. That's why you're hiding these people. Their jobs need to be taken from them. They need to be removed from their positions. Mayor Wu down. This is completely unethical, completely illegal.
So I don't know if you guys heard that, but she said FBI, Homeland Security. Let's talk about where this list went to. It's not even just going to the police. That's how bad this is now. So they're giving out the list of names. This is what we've come to. Mayor Menino is probably rolling over in his grave. Never would have come to this. Never would have come to this.
To target law-abiding citizens, mothers advocating for their children's future.
This is not a mistake. This is not a mistake. And it's not an error. This is deliberate. Deliberate.
Mayor's office, the Boston police, arrested 3 times in the past year and has DCF trying to take her kids away. What advice would you give to somebody like that?
What resources?
This is how far it's gone. Where one of the women that's there, they actually had DCF, you know, they're the ones that come in, the baby snatchers. They had actually had DCF show up to her house, threatening to take her kids away from her. That's how far this has gone. That's not Mayor Wu. That's someone who works for her. But you see what's happening here?
To get all that information, you have to know the public.
What do you do? What do you do when you are a single parent on welfare and the entire local government is coming after you? I don't have money for public records requests. I don't have money to file lawsuits. What do you do when your local government has made you a political target? They're trying to take my kids. They've put me in jail 3 fucking times in the past year. What are we supposed to do?
Now, here you have someone who is on welfare. She doesn't have the money to pay for an attorney. And please don't come at me and say, well, the state will provide one for you. Good luck with the state provided attorney. Good luck with them, okay? Targeting poor people. This is a mess. Whether you agree with their position or not, you don't have to agree with their position. That doesn't mean that they should have DCS show up at their house and threaten to take their kids. Someone on welfare.
I know that like 4 people on that list have been arrested just for protesting with no reason to arrest. They were telling us they're going to arrest us for protesting today. There were political candidates on that list. There's mothers on that list. Multiple of us have been targeted by DCS.
Nobody on that list is a criminal.
Open in court, wasting the time.
So where did this list go, and what was the reason for this list?
This is the thing, I don't have that context for you.
So who would, right?
And
That's the question.
Nobody. I can't give you the same answer.
You're a pawn. Go find somebody who has an answer. You're a pawn. They're all pawns. These people are passing these laws, these unconstitutional laws, to silence us and using you guys all to do their dirty work. And you're just fucking standing here letting them. Go find somebody who has answers. It's been 2 years, Steven. 2 years, Cheevers, that we've been facing off with you guys. Get some fucking answers.
This is your work to happen. These things are happening because of this law turning their head away. And now you're telling us we have to leave so they can continue to ignore us. And then you're going to threaten us 3 times today for arrest. For no law. You mentioned no law. We are here protesting, and you don't know the first thing about protest. Please, you get your legal dictionary over to him ASAP. He's the leader of the police officers here, and he thinks that protest is illegal. He doesn't know it's a protected right. He thinks he can put parameters on us how we disrupt. We came here to disrupt because we're very angry, because our families are being targeted. We're being targeted. Why is somebody's kids being threatened to be taken away from her? I had the head of EMS last week tell me that he was going to turn me in to DCF. Do you see how it's not just a...
My house was surveilled.
I had a private investigator sitting in the parking lot of my job.
I get stopped in.
Do you see the type of retaliation that they've been experiencing? A private investigator showing up at your job, sitting in the parking lot to threaten you so that you'll stop protesting? People need to know about this. Don't feel sorry for Mayor Wu. Don't feel sorry for her that people were protesting outside her home. This is why they're outside her home. Look at now. They're at the office. She's not even there. She won't even talk to them. I'm going to keep it real. I don't have kids, but any of you in the chat, if you have kids, how would you feel if the mayor of your city put your name on a list and then DCF is showing up at your house because you disagreed with the mandates? DCF shows up at your house threatening to take your kids away. How would you feel? But this is the woman of color that everybody said, let's put her on board and make her mayor because she's a woman of color and she's Harvard educated. This was the one that everybody was propping up and said, she's going to be the one to take Boston forward. She's been taking Boston backwards. I'll finish this up here.
Oh, for no reason by somebody
This
calling
guy
my
wants to
phone.
put us in
A
handcuffs.
police officer from household.
Stand down. They're standing down at Mass and Cass. Stand the fuck down here.
This is bad. This is bad.
Yeah, I'm seeing how this is impacting your lives. Like, I'm not...
Years.
And it needs to impact you.
It could happen in your city. It could be your mayor next. But no mayor should be handing over a list of people's names to the police. What is this? What is this? Is Michelle Wu Batman? So disgusting. So disgusting. Like I said, Mayor Menino is probably rolling over in his grave. But she was the progressive that everybody wanted. And you'll see this when we get into the next story about Justice Democrats. You'll see this because they all seem to have something in common. These so-called progressive candidates that run on these progressive issues And then they end up being just like the establishment opponents that they ran against. I don't believe any of these people are progressive. I think these people tell you what you want to hear so that they'll get elected. They know, especially Boston, they know that Boston, there's a lot of young people here, a lot of progressive energy in the area. They tell you what you want to hear so that they can get in. And then they end up being just like everybody else. But hell, even Mayor Menino wouldn't have done this. But it's similar. We've seen this before. Mad Crab just said, remember when AOC had Capitol Police show up to a podcaster's house? LOL. Yeah. The same people who stood out there saying Black Lives Matter, who said what happened to George Floyd was wrong, who said we got to do something about police. They need to be held accountable. The same ones who said that they support defunding the police. Once those people got in office, they became snitches who backed the police state. Terrible. Such a disgrace. I'm going to go to some of the comments here. Thank you so much for the super sticker, Bad Hearts. What's going on? Pastor Wheeler says, not if Wu has anything to do with it. Sadly, she has opened parks and green spaces for development. Yeah, I see you responding to Jeffrey Long. Yeah. Yep. Not for the people, for developers. Thank you for the super chat, Susan. What is their excuse? Horrendous and painfully criminal. Hard to watch. It's really upsetting. Really upsetting. I hope someone runs against her. Oh no, but no, everybody fell for the optics. She could be the first woman of color. She's still Harvard, boo. You think she gonna turn her back on her corporate peers? All righty. We're moving on to the next story. Speaking of people turning their backs, I do not know if you guys have heard this story, but I think it needs more attention. This is in reference to Justice Democrats. Now, Daniel Lippman is the journalist that broke this story. So Daniel Lippman said, big scoop here. Justice Democrats, the progressive PAC that made waves in recent years by helping new generation lefty candidates run against more establishment Dems, laid off 9 of its 20 employees this week as the organization faces a major financial crunch. And we are about to get into this because I hate to say that I told you so, but I told you so. I told you that if the progressives or regressives, we call them here, if they actually didn't start doing these things that they said they were going to do in reference to fighting for progressive issues, if they didn't stop siding with people like Joe Biden and Nancy Pelosi, that the excitement for Justice Democrats, candidates and politicians was going to go away, was going to eventually disappear. And so I want to get into the article here. Just want to make sure I went to the right spot. Here it is. Because this is in Politico. Now listen to this. Major layoffs at Justice Democrats. Justice Democrats, the progressive PAC that made waves in recent years by helping new generation lefty candidates run against more establishment Dems, laid off 9 of its 20 employees this week as the organization faces a major financial crunch. That's coming from Daniel Lippman. It is no secret that Democratic and progressive organizations like us are in a difficult fundraising environment right now. Now, that statement is coming from Justice Democrats Executive Director Alexandra Rojas. I'll show you who she is in just a second, but remember, she was actually the one that agreed with Neera Tanden being added to committees. Remember this? Remember this whole outcry? Why would she be agreeing with Neera Tanden? Okay, let's go on. The group also separately lost its top spokesperson, Waleed Shahid, who left after 6 years and said in a tweet that he was proud to have played a role in building one of the most impactful democratic and progressive organizations from scratch. Shahid is joining the board of the organization as he figures out his next steps. Now, this is one of its top spokespeople. He left on his own. Okay, separately lost. So he's not one of the ones that was laid off. So forget what he said in the tweet. He left on his own. They lost 9 out of 20. They laid off 9 people out of 20. That's almost half. Now, let's take a look at the Justice Democrat. Look, the first thing you see when you go to the website is this. Money, chip in now. The first thing you see. We're electing the next generation of progressive leaders. And then here are the people that they have here. And you know, they all have sold us out, right? The squad. First thing you see, give me money. Now let's click off of here. About Justice Democrats. So you see Ayanna Pressley. You'll see the mission statement. We need a Democratic Party that fights for its voters, not big corporate donors. Have they been doing that? No. They became scabs. They voted against the railroad workers. They voted to send billions of dollars to Nazis in Ukraine. They wouldn't force the vote for Medicare for all at a time when we were in a pandemic and people really needed it. But that's part of the mission statement. Our goal is to build a mission-driven caucus in Congress by electing more leaders like AOC and Jamal Bowman, who will represent our communities in Congress and fight for bold, progressive solutions to our current crisis. But they haven't been doing that. Notice what they did here too. They mentioned AOC and Jamal Bowman, right? You know this is on purpose. Let me make sure I mention a woman of color and one of the black politicians. Since we mentioned the woman, let's mention the man. Because let's be real. I told you guys before, Jamal Bowman is the weakest link when you look at the squad. Now, if we go on, what we do, Justice Democrats is recruiting and support of progressive Democrats all over the country, starting with Congress. We're working to transform the Democratic Party while building independent power. What independent power? They don't even do this. It just, why would you donate to them? We do this by running primary challenges against out-of-touch Democratic incumbents and organizing to hold the party accountable to our issues. What organizing has been done? All the organizing has been happening on the outside, the grassroots. And the majority of the time, they don't participate. Where were they for the Medicare for All marches? The only one that showed up was Cori Bush and complained that she didn't agree with what was being done. What organizing has been done, guys? Let's go on. Who we are. Justice Democrats is a federal political action committee, a PAC, powered by grassroots donations. Let's stop right there. That part isn't even true anymore. We all know, we went over this multiple times. George Soros gives money to Justice Democrats. They started taking billionaire money. And this goes all the way back to before AOC actually won. They realized, oh, we need to raise more money quickly. They started taking billionaire money. Same thing with the Sunrise Movement. Should have never taken money from George Soros. Why are you taking money from billionaires? So that's not even true. We're all grassroots. The PAC uses donation money to hire staff who recruit and train candidates, develop communications, organizing, and digital strategies to drive progressive policies and candidates forward. How have the policies been driven forward, though? Because on the national level, we haven't passed, there's no progressive policies that have been passed on the national level. Locally, some have. but not on the national level. They've been voting along with Nancy Pelosi, agreeing with Joe Biden, endorsing Joe Biden. How are you pushing progressive candidates forward? How are you transforming the Democratic Party when you have all of the squad members in Congress endorsing Joe Biden? It goes on to say, support volunteer canvassers, text bankers, and phone bankers, create videos, send emails to the Justice Democrats email list, and answer help desk emails and any other related work involved that promotes Justice Democrats candidates and issues. Here's the board. Now there's Alexandra Rojas. She was mentioned in the previous article. She's the executive director. This is the one who came forward to praise Neera Tanden. There's Damon Drummer, who's a board member, and there's Nassim Thompson, who is a board member. But this has become a joke. Now, there was an article written a while back. This is on Socialist Alternative. This is by Aaron Brightwell. The State of the Squad, how AOC and House progressives failed to become change makers on the inside. Let's get into this. This is a really good article if you haven't seen it. This was written in March of 2022. I want you to hear what Aaron had to say. In 2018, on her first day in Washington, D.C. as the newly elected congressperson from NYC, Democratic Socialist AOC joined environmental activists as they staged a sit-in at Nancy Pelosi's office in the Capitol building. The message was clear. AOC was not your ordinary establishment politician. All right. Now let's fast forward. AOC spent her first years in office under a Trump presidency. The Democrats controlled only the House and AOC was broadly untested. Then came the election of Joe Biden, a longtime consummate corporate Democrat. This posed a challenge to these progressive leaders in Washington. Would Bernie and AOC consistently oppose the Democratic establishment? Would AOC and the squad galvanize their base and use the slim Democratic margin in Congress to try to win concessions for working class people from the political establishment? Or would they fall in line behind Nancy Pelosi and the rest of Democratic power party structure? I want to highlight this part here about the Trump presidency because this is very, very important. When Justice Democrats first joined Congress, the first couple of members of the squad, we do have to remember that was during the time when Donald Trump was in office. So they were very bold and loud and vocal then. It's easy to do so when the president is a Republican. But what a lot of us noticed was that the moment that Joe Biden won the White House, they were not as vocal anymore. They were not as bold. They were not willing to push back on him, who is Democrat establishment, which was what they were assigned to do. They had one job, one mission at hand, to go in and push back against establishment Democrats. And once Joe Biden won, we saw that they were not going to do that. Let's go on. Alliance with the establishment. More than a year into Biden's presidency, Bernie, AOC, and the squad have been entirely unprepared to stand up for their program of a federal minimum wage, Medicare for all, free public college education, canceling student loan debt, and a Green New Deal. Now, it says here that they were unprepared, right? But on Justice Democrats' website, it says that they train their candidates to be prepared for this, right? To push back against the Democrat establishments. Instead of mobilizing ordinary people to fight for those enormously popular measures, they have abandoned their original goals that got them elected and formed an alliance with Biden to back his watered down agenda. That goes against what's on Justice Democrats' website. This strategy failed miserably, with serious consequences for working class people. The Democrats have failed to get any of their agenda through Congress, other than an extremely business-friendly and highly inadequate infrastructure bill. In addition to the existing crisis of healthcare, housing, student debt, the low wage job economy, and the climate, working people also have to deal with skyrocketing cost of living and seemingly unending deadly pandemic. With midterm elections approaching and Biden's approval numbers having approached historic lows, the door is open for the Trump-dominated Republicans to make major gains. Already, the right has used this momentum to launch new attacks on women, LGBTQ, people in Republican-dominated states. And as we know, there wasn't a red wave, so to speak, but Republicans did take back the House. They go on to talk about the war against Ukraine. It says, aside from making a brief video explaining the real consequence of the U.S. and NATO declaring a no-fly zone, AOC approach on the war has been seriously lacking. She has signed onto a bipartisan letter to the president, which has no anti-war message and which actually leaves open the possibility of direct U.S. military intervention. Working class people didn't send AOC to Congress to get along with capitalist class representatives. Instead of developing a principled anti-war position, AOC has taken the path of least resistance. To her credit, Ilhan Omar, the squad member in the House from Minnesota, has voted against every hawkish pro-war measure, demonstrating a very principled internationalist approach in contrast to her colleagues. This is the important part here. It didn't have to be this way. The failure of Bernie and AOC to build a movement behind their original agenda was in no way predestined. Socialist Alternative explained how AOC could have responded to force the vote by embracing the working class activists who were looking to continue to fight for Medicare for all, regardless of who sat in the president's office. But she wasn't going to do that because she had already had a talking to from people like Nancy Pelosi, who said, don't you go to that protest. Don't you go out there to that Medicare for all march. Don't you go out there with those activists. We have a Democrat in the White House now. And to that point, what I say is, then what was the point of Justice Democrats? If the point of Justice Democrats was just to confuse working class people and to go in Congress and to just get along with establishment Democrats and to vote with them almost 90% of the time anyway, there was no point for this organization to exist. And that's what I want people to understand. The reason why now you see this layoff that's happening at Justice Democrats and you hear the complaints about they're having difficulty fundraising is because the people that were put in office that came from that organization have not lived up to the promises that they made to working class people. They haven't lived up to the promises that they made to all the people who gave $5 and $10 when they didn't really have it to give to their campaigns. All the people that quit their jobs and phone banked and canvassed for those candidates. They didn't live up to any of their promises. They just basically became just another watered down, milquetoast Democrat. So now when people hear the name Justice Democrats, it doesn't hold as much weight as it used to. People don't feel empowered to donate their last $10 or $5 to an organization that is producing a bunch of sellouts. And so what people have to understand, and I'm going to say it like this as clear as day, I believe that Justice Democrats was a grift. I believe that Justice Democrats, the organization, the moment that they decided to take billionaire money was headed downhill. I believe that any time that you have a candidate like AOC, and Zeynep has talked about this, you have a candidate like AOC and they tell the communications director, when you write my bio, say that I'm a bartender because that sounds better. The organization is a grift. Now they raised all this money over the years. And what has this produced for working class people? Not a damn thing. You don't have $15 minimum wage. They didn't force the vote for Medicare for all. Where did all that money go? On their website, they tell you that they train the candidates to be able to fight back against Democrat establishment. Well, if they're so well trained, why is it not happening? And the nerve and the gall for Justice Democrats to continue to ask for money from the American people when they have not produced is disturbing. And these are the things I think that people really need to think about. People are laid off because they don't have the money that they had anymore. You see, it's really easy to fundraise for an organization like Justice Democrats when you have someone in power like a Donald Trump, when the president is on the right. Not as easy when you have someone in office who is a Democrat, Joe Biden, and people see all of a sudden all this vocal energy that these politicians, the squad, had when Trump was in office. All of a sudden, it's very subdued. Rashida Tlaib doesn't even talk the same anymore. When Donald Trump was in office, she said, we're going to impeach him. Now she talks like this. I would really like for Joe Biden to try to put forth measures to also do more for the American people. I saw her response to the State of the Union address. You can't tell me that was the same person that came in 2018. All of these people have succumbed to establishment pressure. They are no longer a part of the working class. And I'd even argue that they probably never really were a part of the working class when they ran in the first damn place. So the organization itself, it doesn't mean anything anymore. It has lost its purpose. And when an organization loses its purpose, people don't feel compelled to give them money, and people don't feel compelled to support it. Now it goes on to say, less than 4 years after she sat with the Sunrise Movement protesters, AOC went to the Global Climate Summit, not to join the youth climate protesters in the streets of Glasgow, but as a part of a U.S. congressional delegation led by, ironically, perhaps Nancy Pelosi. AOC, speaking at an official climate event, reassured the world that when we say that the United States is back, it's not just that we're back in the way that the United States was pursuing climate policy before. It is different. And I would argue that it is fundamentally a different approach. The approach that AOC was talking about from within the convention center at Glasgow was not the Green New Deal that AOC has sometimes championed, and which aims to get net zero carbon emissions by 2050. And that's supposed to be globally. AOC was actually talking about Biden's climate agenda, which was much more modest target and uses marketed incentives to inch closer to net zero goal without any of the transformative political potential of the Green New Deal. Let's go on down here. And this is the piece I really want to hone in on. The Green New Deal, you have to remember, came from the Green Party. AOC and Ed Markey took that and watered it down. And now they've gone from that to accepting the agenda that Biden proposed, which is even more watered down from that. This is why you can't do these changes within the Democratic Party. It is a corporate party. If you want a real Green New Deal, you need to look at the one that's on the Green Party's website. That's the real Green New Deal. This is why I continue to tell people you have to leave the Democratic Party. And we get into this piece. From climate to healthcare, student debt, and the federal minimum wage, progress on the program championed by Bernie Sanders and AOC is stalled. Not only that, but the right wing has gathered serious momentum in attacking women and LGBTQ people, despite broad popular support for abortion access and LGBTQ rights. There has been a massive vacuum of leadership in defending against right-wing attacks. Neither the old liberal women or LGBT groups nor the left of the Democratic Party, including AOC and the squad, have used their platforms to galvanize people to fight back. The absence of a sustained, serious movement in opposing the Texas abortion ban last September has meant that the right wing dominated the Supreme Court is very likely emboldened to overturn Roe v. Wade entirely. And as we know, that happened. Let's go on to this part right here. Oh, I think I was going to the last part. Oh, here we go. As we have raised countless times, if Bernie Sanders had used either his presidential campaign to call for an independent, working class political party, millions would have met that call. Such a party could have been used to organize a fight against attacks from the right and to build political support for the labor struggles that have burst onto the scene. That did not happen. In fact, it ended up being a city councilor from Seattle named Shama Sawant leading that labor movement. That's why Shama Sawant is doing this, because this is what Bernie Sanders was supposed to do. Bernie and the squad, all of them, they got comfortable really quick. And that includes Cori Bush, by the way. And people tell me Cori Bush was homeless. She had to live in her car. She ain't living there now. She got comfortable too. Of course, the opportunity is not lost, and the urgency for a political alternative to the Democrats has only grown. The left needs to learn the lessons from the collapse of Bernie and AOC's legitimacy and immediately end its practice of supporting lesser evil Democrats. We need to run independent, working class candidates across the country as the first step to building a new political party. Just as Democrats is having difficulty financially, because just as Democrats has failed. And it didn't just fail as an organization. More importantly, it failed working class people. And I'll say this again. You cannot go around this country asking working class people for money and for help when you know a lot of them don't have it to give, but they do it because they believe in you. And then you abandon an entire class of people and you expect them to still support you. You cannot do that. This has all become a joke, a big, fat joke. That's why they had to lay people off. That's why they're having financial troubles. That's why people don't want to donate to them anymore. I'll take that comment on Rockfin, Eric. Thank you for the comment on Rockfin, Roger. Sabby, this looks exactly like what we went through when we were protesting outside New York State Senate Majority Leader Andrea Stewart Cousins, when we tried to deliver signed postcards of people suffering from medical conditions who wanted her to pass the New York Health Act, which has majority support in both chambers of the New York State Legislature. This sister, yes, sister, called the state popo on us who came running upstairs. You see how this works? They call the cops on their own constituents. What a mess. Sebastian says sellouts asking for, gasp, money from the working class whom they sold out to. Tia says the point of Justice Democrats was to put the people to sleep and keep them sitting on their hands. There you go. And I want to know where all that money went. I remember when Kyle Kalinske and Humanist Report, when they first announced this, you guys know they were able to raise like $1 million. I think it was in 24 hours. They were able to raise like $1 million. Where'd all that money go? You know what we could have done with that money? That $1 million? We could have built clinics in communities that don't have hospitals. We could have fed people. We could have clothed people. $1 million down the drain. What a fucking joke. All right. We're going to go on to the next story. We're still focusing on money here. Richard Wolff is back at it again. He's been killing it recently. He's focusing this time on global capitalism. And I think we need to talk about this because I know I've touched on this before where the United States is not what it once was. And I think some people keep feeling like we are going to bounce back to being number one and the best economically. I don't believe that's true. And there's a couple of things that point to a different direction. And Richard Wolff is going to get into that, and I'll chime in between. You have to understand that other countries, they found a way to really help their country, the leaders of those countries, and not just help their country economically and financially, but also to help the people. They're trying to find ways to help the people in their country. We don't have that here. We have a government that's willing to give billions of dollars to another country, but we have people setting up tents all across America. Let's get into this with Richard Wolff.
Now, in modern capitalism, particularly that in the West, we refer to it often with the adjective private capitalism. And I want to begin by talking about how private capitalism is turning more and more to an authoritarian state. And my focus is going to be on the United States because of its leadership and importance in the world of private capitalism. And all the word private means is that the capitalists, the employers, are not operatives of a state. They don't hold a position in a government. They are not a state official of any kind. They are private individuals who undertake privately run, owned production. And they have been, for most of the history of capitalism, leery of authoritarian states. They were not interested in them. They wanted the state to be weak, distant, and mostly to leave the private capitalist alone. They used the French phrase, leave me alone, laissez-faire, to describe the kind of capitalism they endorsed. And private capitalism has been the norm in the United States, Western Europe, Japan, the old centers of capitalism over the last century or two. Why then might they today be turning to an authoritarian state? What do I mean by an authoritarian state? I mean a state that is not only allowed, but welcomed to intervene in the economy in all kinds of ways that used to be taboo, that used to be opposed by private capitalists. Far from opposing it, now most of them welcome it. Yes, there are groups that still are leery about this and don't want it. It's not universal, but the shift is unmistakable. And I'm only going to have time to give you some examples of the shift as it's going on. One way to understand it is to recognize that words which were until recently celebrated are now denounced. Globalization. We were told from the 1960s onward that as corporations expanded around the world, they could become more efficient. They could get closer to the sources of inputs they needed, the natural resources, and so on. They could take advantage of lower wages to cheapen the prices of things we here in the United States or Western Europe or Japan consume.
And as those businesses started to expand, for example, businesses like Amazon and Walmart, they actually made things more difficult for the mom and pop shops, for small businesses. They actually made it so that if I go to the mall in Cambridge right now, most of the stores have closed. They can't compete. They can't compete with online shopping on Amazon. They can't compete with Walmart. Like the hardware stores, the local, saw one earlier today that was closed. The local hardware stores that people used to have in their towns and like their communities, a lot of those they're gone because they couldn't compete with the hardware section in Walmart, which was selling those tools for a lot cheaper. They couldn't compete. So you have to think about sometimes expansion is not necessarily the best idea. So you end up with fewer, smaller businesses. And then when we talk about global expansion, it gets to the point where if you want to save money, then you start sending parts overseas. Instead of Ford, for example, making their parts right here in the United States, let's send these parts over to China and Mexico and let them make the parts. And then we can lay off some of these employees. That'll save us money. And the CEOs continue to get richer. That's the thing about expansion.
So on. Globalization made capitalism more dynamic, more efficient. We were to celebrate it. And our political leaders, Republican and Democrat alike, fell all over themselves cheerleading for globalization. and for the other big term, neoliberalism, whose idea was simply let these companies go around the world. Don't hold them back. Don't limit them. Don't regulate them. Let them go. Notice again, laissez-faire. Let them go. Let the private folks do what they want. The government should keep out of it. And the corporations went. They went all over the world, particularly to China, because the wages there.
Sorry, 1 second. I was making sure. It looks a little fuzzy. I don't know why, but here we go. So he's talking about the part where they started to go to countries like China, right? Because it's cheaper for them to do that. There were no limitations. They could go wherever they wanted to go, not thinking about how that would affect the economy here in the US and how that would affect businesses here and, of course, the workers.
Were much lower than in Western Europe, North America, and Japan. And the market in China was growing faster than in Western Europe, North America, and Japan. And if capitalists know anything, they know that if you want to succeed in competition, you better go where the wages are lowest and the market is growing fastest, because that's where you will succeed. Well, the problem is, over the last 30 to 40 years, as capitalists globalized, going to China as well as many other countries, and that was true not only of American capitalists, but of Western European and Japanese capitalists as well, the Chinese managed the process quite differently from the way other countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, the so-called global South, how they had managed it. The Chinese made sure it would go to the advantage of development in and by China, so that by today, China has demonstrated that it got a bigger set of gains out of neoliberal globalization than the countries that invented and produced neoliberal globalization.
And now it has, Eric, can you refresh that and then bring it back to 1018? Now it has gotten to the point where the United States government, we heavily depend on those countries to produce. One of the biggest mistakes I think that happened was NAFTA. That's one of the biggest mistakes, sending all those jobs like overseas. You look at a city like Detroit, for example, and you see how at one point in time, a thriving auto industry in that city. So many people moved to Detroit for those jobs, to work in those factories. Capitalists got greedy, decided it would be cheaper to make the parts overseas. And you see what else happened to Detroit. Once the jobs started to leave, the people started to leave. And that includes the teachers. And they moved to places that have better salaries or still had a thriving economy for the most part. And then they had to close schools in Detroit. This is why when you hear Rome, my comrade from RBN, say he watched them close 40 schools in Detroit, this is still an issue. And this is why, because you look at these things and you just see that like it's a domino effect. All it takes is for one domino to fall, and then it affects other areas and other factors as well. So that's a big part of the problem. But you see how that happened. The jobs went away. Jobs go away. The people are going to leave. People aren't going to stay in a city where there's no jobs. They're going to have to leave and go somewhere else. They take their kids with them. When they leave, they take their wealth with them. And that's how you get a city like Detroit becoming the way that it did. Problem is, it's not even just Detroit anymore. It's happening all across this country.
Liberal globalization. A kind of surprise has dawned on the world. And why am I telling you this? Because you probably already know it. I'm telling you it because the competition from China particularly, but also now from its allies, particularly the so-called BRICS, B-R-I-C-S, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. China and these allies are now a bigger economic powerhouse then the G7, which is the United States and its allies in Western Europe, plus Canada and Japan.
Right. They are not relying on the US to basically help them at all. All these countries that came together and said, let's, be a part of BRICS, they're even moving towards like having their own currency. They're not waiting on the United States. They don't care about this at all. So the thing is they are moving on without us, and they're not going to try to have any type of limitation put on them from the United States government. Now, how do they do that? By having their own currency. As long as they are attached to the US dollar, the United States will always be able to sanction them. You take away that attachment from the US dollar, you take away the ability for the US government to sanction these countries. And the US government knows that. And that is why the government is so heavily, honed in on attacking a country like China, because they know China does not need them. They see this now, but they're the ones that made it that way. When you sent all those jobs after you sent all those jobs over to China, when you sent all the business over there, what did you expect the people to do? Now you want to fault a country like China for being successful off of a model that you basically told them about. Think about it.
The BRICS alliance produces about 33% of the world's output. The United States and its G7 alliance produce about 29%. In many fundamental ways, the dominance of the old Western centers of capitalism, Western Europe, North America, and Japan, is over. And they have been and will continue to be replaced by the ascendancy of the BRICS alliance.
It's over. The US had a really good run for quite a while, I think. But that has come to an end. For all the people who say we'll bounce back, we'll get back to where we were, I don't think so. I don't think so. Listen, think about how some of these countries have been exploited. Think about countries in the global South that have been exploited, not just by the the United States and Canada, actually, but also by Europe. We talked about this before when we went over the video from Second Thought about how some of these countries that have social democracy, like with Bernie Sanders, like champions, these countries like Denmark, etc. One of the reasons why they're able to have that is because they exploit the labor from the global South. So they may not exploit their own citizens. They're making sure they still get to have ample, vacation time. They're making sure that if they have maternity leave, they can have 9 months of maternity leave after they have the baby. But they have been exploiting workers in the global South so that they can have those things. So you can't expect those countries in the global South, you can't expect them to just sit around forever and just continue to be treated this way. This is why you have a Brazil that is a part of BRICS. Lula knows this. They know this. So I don't believe that the US economically will ever get back to the point that it was. And I think people need to start paying attention to this. And don't be surprised if you start to see more Americans leave the US and choose to live abroad. That's another thing that's been happening. People leaving the US, moving to countries like Canada, moving to Brazil. In fact, I know 3 people moved to Brazil, moving to China. Like, this is not unusual. And I think that will become more common as things get worse.
To give you simply one indication, economic growth this year, 2023, is expected to be between 0 and 0.2% in Europe. In the United States, it's expected to be between 1 and 2%. In the People's Republic of China, it's expected to be between 5 and 5.5%.
You see the difference? That's what happens when you produce your own products, when you produce your own goods and services. There is a change.
Inflation in Europe is devastating, over 10% for the area. In the United States, it's bad, but 5%. The inflation rate in the People's Republic of China this year is 0.7%.
Ding, ding, ding. Everyone paying attention? The UK was hit pretty hard with inflation. We've talked about it a couple times on the show. Germany, we announced this like a month ago that Germany had officially entered a recession. Remember that? China seems to be doing pretty well. This is why, and I've said this before, why do you think the US government is trying to, I guess in a way, I don't want to say egg on China, but they're trying to, piss China off, basically, so to speak. Why do you think that? Why do you think Nancy Pelosi taking the trips to Taiwan, them saying that they're spying on us, all the kind of stuff? Why do you think they're trying to push? Because they see what's happening economically. There's a doctrine, we talked about this before, the Wolfman's doctrine, which basically said that the US government was the only one that was allowed to basically be number one and police the world. A real doctrine. So that means that any other country that becomes competition for the United States, the US government is going to try to find a way to keep them down. That would be a China and that would be a Russia. So people have to pay attention. This is all connected economically.
There is no contest. Why am I telling you this? Because the United States' reaction, and that of Europe as well, to the rise of China and the BRICS has been a major adjustment in the direction of wanting the activity of an authoritarian state. In the place of neoliberalism and globalization, we are turning to economic nationalism. Here are some of the signs that I'm sure you've noticed. The United States is demonizing China, top to bottom, reminiscent of the Cold War when that was done to the Soviet Union. The United States is punishing selected Chinese companies. The United States government is threatening and sanctioning enterprises and governments around the world that trade with China. The United States is forbidding export of private companies' private outputs to China, particularly in the area of microchips. I could go on. President Trump hit China with tariffs, making every Chinese product more expensive in the United States because you had to pay not only the price of the good, but the tariff tax added by the United States on top of it.
You see how they try to ruin other countries that they consider to be a competition economically? This is insane when you think about this. Is the information that you're hearing from Professor Richard Wolff. This is what mainstream media is not telling you when they talk about China. They make it seem like China is just this huge, big, bad boogeyman that just wants to come after the United States. For the most part, they're not even thinking about us. They got their own stuff going on. They don't need us. We need them more than they need us. Economically, yes, armed and hammered. Wolfowitz doctrine. Thank you. Yes, the Wolfowitz doctrine, which basically says that no other country can rise to that power. That is only for the United States. Isn't this some crazy shit? When you hear about it, it's crazy. It's insane. You're not allowed to have any competition economically. And look where this has gotten us as a country.
We have trade wars. The Biden administration has continued them. There is a governmental interference in our economy, which would have made earlier generations totally outraged because it violates the notion that private capitalism is best left alone by a non-interfering, non-intervening government. Well, that's only the beginning of the story. The reality is that the United States' empire, the building up of which happened particularly after the Second World War, when the United States replaced the old colonial masters in Western Europe and Japan with its new informal empire. We didn't have colonies, with a few exceptions, but we very similarly managed. The United States has hundreds of military bases around the world in a way no other country has.
Regime change, removing leaders in other countries and putting in the ones that the US government finds to be acceptable. The military bases. Do you need 800 military bases around the world? What if it were the other way around? What if it was China that had 800 military bases around the world and they were surrounding the United States? How would you feel? These are things I think a lot of times American people just don't think about. Like, it's just become so accepted. It's so normal in our society. Like, it's just okay for us to have this happen. It's not okay. Why is the United States, government policing the entire world? Who decided that the U.S. would be number one and only the U.S. can be number one? Who made these decisions? And I say this because you have to understand, when you see the way that some of these other leaders in other countries are pushing back on the U.S. government, you have to understand why that is. It's not necessarily because they just want to bully us. It's because the U.S. government has had their hand in the pockets of all these countries. And every time these countries tried to get a little bit of success, here they come to snatch the money away. Why do you think a country like Haiti is so poor? Let's talk about this. A country like Haiti, which was rich in resources, the people there are so poor because the U.S. government, going all the way back to Woodrow Wilson, sent the U.S. Marines into Haiti, not only took over their businesses, but took over their banks. The U.S. government did that, people. And then people ask, why are they coming here? Why are all these migrants coming here? Because there's nothing there. There's nothing left for them in these countries. The U.S. government has destroyed these people in their countries. Look at Yemen. Can you live in Yemen right now? That's what it does. And anyone, especially if you are not one of their allies, but even if you are an ally, who's to say it won't come a time when the U.S. government may not turn on the UK, may not turn on France? If Germany gets a little too successful, a little too happy, may not turn on Germany. You never know. We'll go on a little bit more here.
No other country comes close. We operate an empire, and that empire is in deep trouble. It's shrinking. The war the United States went into in Korea ended in a kind of stalemate, not a victory. The war in Vietnam, an attempt to maintain the empire over there, the United States was flat out defeated. In Afghanistan, again. In Iraq, basically, again. Much of the pressure leading the United States to be so actively involved in the Ukraine war is also an attempt to hold on to a dominant world position that is in trouble, is shrinking. Like every other empire in the history of the world, this one, having been born, having grown, having evolved, is now in decline.
Well said, Professor Richard Wolff. If you want to see the full video, because this video is over 58 minutes. It's on Democracy at Work. It's called Global Capitalism. Capitalism Turns to the Authoritarian State. Check that out. That was uploaded 3 days ago. You guys have got to see the full discussion. And I watched the entire video. But it's very powerful. What Richard Wolff is saying there, and it's true. Like, it's in decline. That's why they're pressuring. Russia is not innocent. Russia has its issues too. But the reason why you see them targeting countries like Russia, countries like China, they know that there's serious competition. China, if you look at the top 10 banks in the world, China has most of the top banks in the world on that list. I've shown it on the show multiple times. China does, not the US. The first time an American bank actually appears on that list is number 6, and that's JP Morgan. So you can guess who's in the top 5. Times have changed. Matthew said, have you noticed when wages increase, rents go up that much more? They don't really want you to get out of your situation. They'll give you a wage increase, but then also not just your rent will increase, but also your healthcare premiums increase. So are you really getting a raise? JB says the US is jealous of China and wants to sabotage them instead of competing fairly. It's like throwing a brick at the runner's feet while you're racing them because they're winning. Exactly. That's right. Thank you for the super chat, Chicka Boom Boom too. The US of Satan, the United States of Satan is a global nightmare over the earth. I'll take the comments on Rockfin and then we'll go to the next story. Thank you for the tip on Rockfin, Roger. Time for a local ballot measure in Boston to outlaw private equity from owning housing, hospitals, nursing homes, clinics, dialysis centers, medical facilities, while at the same time. We're going to have to take Senator Eldred's bill and run it as both an initiative for law and an amendment. I agree with that. The U.S. is about to go down. Sound like we are about to get reparations, y'all. Sabrina, if you watch the movie The Take as presented to me by Marco, I saw how the Peronists lost influence starting in the early 90s and brought in their version of Reagan, who completely gave their government over to corporate, making it a capitalist utopia. Complete and total collapse. Factories that were abandoned. Yeah, it's a mess, man. It's a mess out there. But Richard Wolff is like awesome. He always hits the nail on the head. If you have not had a chance to do so, go ahead and smash that like button. That helps me with the algo. Thank you very much. We're moving on to the story here about Tucker Carlson. I don't know if you guys have seen this, but there was an event, a family event for GOP candidates. Now, Tucker Carlson was the host. There were a couple of candidates here that he spoke to. It was really interesting. I did not find any video footage of him speaking to Donald Trump, so I don't know if Donald Trump wasn't invited or if he was invited and he just wasn't able to make it. I don't know. Ron DeSantis was there, just FYI, for those wondering. We'll show something about that in a second. But I actually called this the exposure of most of these candidates. Now, first up is Tim Scott. And I want to talk about this because I think Tucker Carlson did ask them questions that you would not see most of these commentators ask on mainstream media. I think if he was still a part of Fox News, I don't think they would have let him ask some of these questions that he did. But I think what he exposed is that at the end of the day, none of these candidates actually care about the people in this country or working class people. And they were exposed. I want to start off with Tim Scott. This particular discussion is in reference to the war in Ukraine and Joe Biden announcing that he's sending the 3,000 troops overseas. Now, Tim Scott starts off okay, but then he falls for the okie doke. Listen to this.
Amen. So, a nation that great has to beware of threats to its very existence.
Absolutely.
Yesterday, Biden mobilized reserves. What do you think of that? And are you concerned that we're moving, as we seem to be, toward war with Russia?
Yeah, so I would say that without any question, we should never allow American soldiers to be engulfed into the challenge between Ukraine and Russia. Our boots on the ground should not be there. The ability...
That's actually a decent answer to that question. He starts off okay, but then Tim shows you exactly who he really is. Another war hawk. Listen to this.
My mama wanted a preacher, so I'm going to stand up and do it the Southern way.
Preach!
Hallelujah! So, literally, I think one of the failures of President Biden has been his inability to articulate America's national vital interest in the conflict or the genocide in Ukraine. America's national vital interest is degrading the Russian military. When we degrade the Russian military, we make sure that our home front is safer and that our NATO ally partners that would cause us to send soldiers over is safe. When we have the land contiguous with Ukraine safe, we keep our American soldiers at home, and our primary objective should only be to engage when America's vital national interests are being engaged in. Unfortunately, President Biden has no ability to understand and appreciate what that looks like.
Wait, may I ask?
So Tim Scott goes on to say that the U.S. should be focused on basically degrading Russia's military. The look on Tucker's face is really funny because, like I said, like you actually start off pretty well saying, no, our troops should not be there. Actually, what we should be focused on is degrading Russia's military. What? You're still a war hawk. It goes on.
You're saying that it's in our national interest, vital national interest, to degrade the Russian military, in other words, to fight Russia with other people's soldiers.
I would say it this way. If you think about the world order that we established after World War II, if you think about a rules-based system, where does a rules-based system come from? It comes from this nation, our Judeo-Christian foundation, that says that there are rules of the road, that there is something called absolute truth.
Pause. So he's talking about the rules-based system. So think back to that Wolfowitz doctrine that I was just telling you about, right? He's not going to say these exact words, but this is what he's getting at. What he's getting at is, again, that the U.S., only the U.S. can be number one, and anyone else, they need to be taken out. Even before there's a possibility of something like that happening, the U.S. needs to go in and take care of them and dismantle Russia's military. Because again, going back to that doctrine, we can only be the ones. This is why I say he's a war hawk. This is exactly what he's saying. Listen to this.
And we established that. As a part of that absolute truth, what we're trying to do is make sure that our home front remains safe. Keeping our home front safe means that evaluating the actual threats to our country, the most immediate military threat that could happen is Russia. Why is a good question. You look at their 6th generation jets, you look at their...
Listen to this, the threats to our country. This is how they'll frame it. This is how they frame it. This country could be a particular threat to us, so we got to go in and do what we need to do.
Their hypersonic weapons, you look at their nuclear arsenal, everything that we do that degrades the Russian military is good for America. You look at the long-term threat to our nation, it's China. Their existential threat that we face long-term becomes China. You look at this rising axis of evil that we're seeing being formed, it's Russia, China, and Iran.
Why China? What did I tell you? We were just finished talking about the global capitalism conversation. What did I tell you? China, Russia, they focus on those countries. But again, like I told you, because China economically is doing better than the United States. That's what this is really about.
Breaking that to pieces before it gets started, I think, is in our vital interest.
So on the day last February that Russia invaded eastern Ukraine, Russia and China were not allied, but within weeks of the sanctions that we applied and the stated intent of the Biden administration to effectively wage war with Russia, you saw an alignment which is now hardened between Russia and China. The United States military cannot, as you know, since you oversee it as a member of the Senate, cannot actually defeat Russia and China united.
Nope.
And so it would seem that the Biden policies have created a larger threat, no?
Well, I would say it by looking back to 2014. There are 2 times that we've seen incursions in Ukraine that create peril for America. The first time was under President Obama when he drew that red line in Syria and nothing happened, which gave permission to Putin to come in and take Crimea. The second time we saw was when President Biden sat back and watched as Scholz in Germany led the Western alliance to provide resources to Ukraine, which was a mistake colossal on our part. So what you saw was President Biden saying to Putin, I'm going to give you a list of areas that we don't want you to have cyber attacks. Weakness. Second that we saw.
So let me just come in and say this. Tim started off okay, but then Tim revealed himself as well. Like he's a war hawk. Basically, like Tim feels the same way. Look, Tim is against Joe Biden because Joe Biden's a Democrat and Tim Scott is a Republican. But don't get it twisted. When it comes to the MIC, when it comes to war, Tim is on board with Joe. So he told you he don't agree with him sending the troops over there, but he still agrees with trying to dismantle their military and try to knock China and Russia out of the park. He still agrees with that. And he's not alone. It's not just him. Enter Nikki Haley. She's a piece of work. She was my governor, my former governor, when I lived in South Carolina. I told you back then she was a war hawk. I don't know why this woman is running for Congress, or not Congress, excuse me, running for president, but she's no better. Listen, it gets worse.
United Nations. There were 2 things our enemies never wanted us to have. They never wanted us to be energy independent, and they never wanted us to have a strong military. We have to always have both of those things.
Well, speaking of energy in the military,
You think the country's in a lot of trouble, but that's not your concern. This is the craziest stuff I've ever heard. And then there's one more. Now, this one, he probably did the best, but I'm about to push back on him because Tucker didn't push back on him. Maybe he didn't know about this, but I'm about to tell you guys about it. I'm about to tell you guys about it. And that is Vivek. So Vivek, he's talking about privilege. First of all, privilege is not about money. People need to look up the definition of privilege. So I need people to stop saying that they're not privileged because they weren't born rich. That's not what the word means. But that's what he starts off with. Listen to this. This is important. Here we go.
But the interesting answer is actually what I do tell him, Tucker, is that I did have privilege. I didn't grow up in money, but I had 2 parents in the house, a mother and a father with a focus on education and a...
Pause for a second. All right. He says he did have privilege, but he didn't grow up in money. Okay. So again, I want to say this one more time. Privilege does not mean you're wealthy. Privilege doesn't mean that you have money. You can have privilege based on other issues. Okay. Other criteria. Doesn't mean that you're rich, but he's not even telling the truth about that. Let's let this finish. I'm about to prove all this. And I don't think Tucker knew this, but I'm about to show you.
I didn't grow up in money, but I had 2 parents in the house, a mother and a father with a focus on education and a faith in God. And you know what? That is the ultimate privilege. That if I'm going to enjoy that, every kid in this country ought to enjoy it too.
All right. He grew up in a 2-parent household, didn't grow up with money. But let's keep it real. It's not like he grew up poor, working class either. I want to be very clear because let's see how he grew up. Look at this, guy. See, I told you I'd be looking for shit. Listen to this. Vivek. He was born in Cincinnati, Ohio to Indian Hindu immigrant parents and was raised in Ohio. This is tiny. Sorry. I just want you to be able to see it. Okay, you can see it better now. His father was a graduate of Regional Engineering College. His father worked as an engineer and a patent attorney for GE. His mother was a graduate from Mysore Medical College and a geriatric psychiatrist. So Vivek may not have grown up rich, but that motherfucker didn't grow up poor, working class either. Let's keep it real. So let's stop pretending like I just want to put that out there. I'm sorry. But you got a father who was an engineer and a patent attorney. And then you have a mom who was a geriatric psychiatrist. So it's not like he was struggling. Now, I don't know if Tucker knew that, but I would have pushed back on that. Would have pushed back definitely on that. So it's not just because he came from a two-parent household. He came from a two-parent household that was college educated and that had the means to help him become college educated because they had the careers and the salaries to do so. Let's keep it real. And I'll tell you, I've spoken to my friend about this before too, because we talked about this many years ago. A friend of mine, her parents are from India, and she was born here in the US like Vivek. And you know what she told me? She told me that when her people immigrate to this country, she said they already are educated and have the money. She said it's different when you look at people coming from like Haiti, fleeing a situation there. When you look at people coming from Mexico, fleeing cartels and the economic situation in Mexico, she said most of us come over, we already have the degrees or we're coming over here to get the degrees. But typically we already where we need to be for the most part. That's something to think about. So that was Vivek. But what I think Tucker should have mentioned when he brought up the problems that are happening in this country, I think he should have mentioned the why. And the why is because of poverty. Crime has increased because of poverty. About 80% of crime you connect to poverty, believe it or not. The homelessness rate has increased because of poverty. All these things are connected. Why do you think you see all these tent communities now? It's not like it never happened before, but it's worse now. And that's what I said earlier. Everybody keeps saying San Francisco, and people keep saying San Francisco and Los Angeles. Those are two cities they usually bring up. They say they have the tent communities. We have tent communities here in Boston. There's tent communities in Austin, Texas, Nashville, Tennessee. It's everywhere now. Poverty has increased since the pandemic. It was already increasing before that. Pandemic made it worse. So I think it's important to address the underlying issue. Just something to think about. Okay, we are going to go through South Carolina. There's only 2 questions for South Carolina for the ballot initiatives. But if you haven't had a chance to do so, go ahead and smash that like button. Thank you so much for that. Helps me with the algo. Thank you for the super chat, Sam. Did everyone forget Afghanistan? Oh, it's a good one. Thank you for the super chat, Chickaboom. Thank you, Sister Sabby. Thank you for the super sticker, Juliet. Hi, Julie. And thank you for the super chat, Eric. Just call me Mike. Mike Pence. Mother says that I must also properly be chaperoned around the pores. Oh my God. He's like a robot. I'm sorry. That guy's like a robot. All right. South Carolina wins for November 2022. South Carolina voters do not have the right and the option to place their own initiatives on the ballot to pass and repeal state laws and amend the South Carolina Constitution on their own. Voters only have the power to ratify into South Carolina Constitution what the legislature puts before them through what's called a legislative referred constitutional amendment, aka legislator initiative. Amendment 1, General Reserve Fund Increase Measure. A yes vote supported increasing the General Reserve Fund from 5% of state general fund revenue to 7% incrementally by 0.5% increase each year. This measure passed or was ratified by 61.89%. General Reserve Fund, as well as the Capital Reserve Fund, are South Carolina's 2 rainy day funds, also known as budget stabilization funds. It is used to cover year-ending operating budget deficits when the state's general fund revenue collections cannot fully fund the state's expenditures into a fiscal year. Who supported this? Republicans, Senators Thomas Alexander, for example. Who opposed it? There was no opposition. There was no money spent to support or oppose that measure. Measure 2, South Carolina Amendment Capital Reserve Fund Increase Measure. A yes vote supported increase in the Capital Reserve Fund from 2% to 3% of state general fund revenue, and providing that the first use of the Capital Reserve Fund is to offset mid-year budget reductions. This was ratified by 62.46%. The amendment increased the Capital Reserve Fund annual funding requirement from 2% to 3% of state general fund revenue. The amendment provided that the first use of the CRF would be to offset mid-year reductions. As of 2022, CRF funds could not be used to offset a mid-year budget reduction. The measure required the South Carolina General Assembly to provide in state law that if before March 1st, expenditures for the current fiscal year are projected to exceed the projected revenue for the year, then the current year's appropriation to the Capital Reserve Fund must be reduced before any appropriate CRF funds by a 2/3 vote for capital improvement projects and to pay interest and principal on bonds. Who supported this? This was actually somewhat bipartisan. 3 Republicans and 1 Democrat. The Democrat's name is John Scott, if anyone's familiar with him. There was no opposition to this measure, and there was no campaign finance money spent to support or oppose the measure. And that is South Carolina. Tuesday, we'll dive into Tennessee. Tennessee. All right, I'll take that comment on Rockfin and then we'll skadoodle. Thank you for the tip on Rockfin, Roger. Their currency was debased, so the workers rolled up their sleeves, went back to factories, took them over, brought them back. In doing so, brought their economy back and the value of their currency up. It was so successful that the original owners of the factories wanted it back, and the president who brought Argentina down went to run for president again. In order to build something new, you must tear down old. Well said, Roger. Well said. All right, guys, that is it for me. Thank you so much for hanging out with me. I am not here on Mondays. I will be back Tuesday, but tomorrow, please enjoy clips. Other than that, guys, you know how we do this. Have a good night. Keep up the fight.